Dear colleagues and friends around the world, dear Susanna, I would like to talk about the behavioral dimensions of international cooperation, and I would like to focus on basic mechanisms of cooperation at this scale, actually, in local groups and at the international level. And I would like to introduce to you a research strand which we have been developing during the last months, where we try to bring together knowledge from any discipline, any academic discipline, to understand better how humans cooperate. So it is about the basic mechanisms of cooperation, which I would like to talk about. I would like to move you through a series of slides during the next 20 minutes. And the first slide is, the first slide is this one here. This is a very big picture, and this is the context in which we think about international cooperation, because from our perspective, human mankind is moving into a third-grade transformation process. So we already moved as human mankind, as modern civilization, through two great transformations in the history of human mankind. The first big transformation from our perspective was the Neolithic Revolution, which started more or less 10,000, 12,000 years ago. So human mankind invented agriculture, and human mankind then invented small villages. We started to organize ourselves in communities. And what you can see in this slide here, which is from an American colleague, Professor Vogel, he got a Nobel Laureate Prize in economics, and he was interested in big global innovation dynamics. And what you can see in this slide is that after the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution, we saw big human inventions, innovations in steps of thousands of years. And if you look at this slide, you can see that the invention of cities was one of these big inventions from the perspective of Professor Vogel. The invention of the printing press was another one, which was important for the Industrial Revolution, for inventing science and the communication between many people. So this was the first big shift in human mankind, the Neolithic Revolution. The second big shift was the Industrial Revolution, which happened more or less 250 years ago. This was an acceleration of innovation. And Professor Vogel is demonstrating that after having seen these big innovations in steps of thousands of years, the Industrial Revolution was driven by inventions which came up in periods of 30, 40 years only. So the Industrial Revolution was driven by huge innovations. And what has been coming up in this period then was industrial societies, nation states, at the end of the day, the international system, the United Nations. And our argument is that we are now moving into a third great transformation of human mankind, where we need much more international cooperation. And this third great transformation is characterized by three major dynamics. The first one is global interdependencies, globalization, accelerated globalization, and we need more global cooperation, more global governance to manage these global interdependencies. But there is a second important driver which makes global governance and global cooperation more complex, because at the same time in which we see these accelerated globalization, we see that a post-Western world order is emerging. The last 250 years have been driven by OECD countries, by Western societies. Now countries like China, India, and others are emerging, a post-Western society. And in this context of shifting power structures, we need to organize global cooperation. And the third important aspect of this third great transformation is that we as human beings, for the first time in the history of the Earth system itself, we are now the most important geological driver in the Earth system. So we need to learn to steer and to manage the Earth system itself. And obviously this is absolutely impossible without international cooperation. So this is the big picture in which we think about global cooperation. My field of research is focusing on transformation processes towards sustainability. So our big issue is what I've been mentioning before, human mankind now being the most important driver in the Earth system. So when you try to understand the dynamics in the Earth system, the future of the ocean, the future of the atmosphere, the future of global landscapes, It's as important to understand physics and chemics on the one hand side, but you will only understand the future of the oceans, the future of the atmosphere, when you understand how humans use these kind of global ecosystems. We are the masters of the universe, to say so, in a new era of human mankind, which many scientists now call the Anthropocene. So the era where human mankind drives the global Earth system. And in this context, global cooperation is absolutely critical to manage the transformation towards global sustainability. So the basic question then is, how can we learn to cooperate in a world of 9 billion people? And what you can see here at this slide are different perspectives on how we can learn to cooperate in a world of 9 billion people. There is John Mersheimer. He's one of the important scholars in the field of international relations, coming from a neo-realistic perspective. He argues that great powers ultimate aim is to gain a position of dominant power over others, because having dominant power is the best means to ensure one's own survival. So this is about power games. From this perspective, cooperation is a very naive concept for the international system, for managing international dynamics. You then see here Professor Benkler. He is a lawyer and he's a psychologist working at Harvard, and he argues that I believe we are ready to break free of the selfishness myth and embrace human cooperation as the powerful and potential positive force that it is. So this is completely different from Professor Mersheimer, because Benkler is arguing that we are very good at cooperating. We only need to break the myth of selfishness. I will come back to this point, obviously. The third phrase which you find here is from Professor Tomasello. He is the director of the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig for social anthropology. And he is arguing that humans putting their heads together in shared cooperative activities are thus the originators of human culture. So from the Tomasello perspective, cooperation is the basic driver of human civilization. It's the basic driver of human culture. If you look into international relations theory, if you look into global governance theory, this is the field where I'm coming from. I'm an economist and I'm a political scientist. If you look into the literature on global governance, you will get a very pessimistic perspective on the opportunities for global cooperation. If you look in the latest literature, I brought you some examples here. You see on the left-hand side, Professor Bremer. He wrote a book which is called Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in the G0 World. So he's arguing that we made the shift from a G8, G7, G8 constellation towards a G20 world, but de facto, in reality, we are in a situation in which no one cares about global affairs, the G0 world. This is I. Bremer. You see Charles Kupchan on the right-hand side, No One's World, from 2012 also, a very similar perspective, and you need to know that Charles Kupchan is someone who is really looking for how to organize cooperation worldwide. He was one of the main advisors to President Clinton several years ago. When he was president, Clinton was president. So Kupchan now is arguing that we are living currently in no one's world. You see on the left-hand side at the bottom Thomas Hell and David Held. David Held is one of the most important scholars in the field of cosmopolitan democracy, so trying to think about the future of international cooperation. But he published a book in 2013 last year which is called Gridlock, and he is arguing that we find ourselves currently in a situation in which global cooperation does not work at all, in a situation in which we need it most. So on the right-hand side, again, John Mersheimer, I already cited him, the tragedy of great power politics. From his perspective, cooperation is a very difficult, if not impossible, endeavor in the international system. Politics is driven exclusively by power structures. So this is the perspective of global governance scholars currently, and I would like to show you now that at the end of the day, if you look into many disciplines, also beyond political sciences and economics, and ask the questions, are humans, we as human beings, good or bad at cooperating, you will find three different strands of arguments and three different schools, to say so. There is one school which is arguing that that we as human beings are very bad at cooperating. We are selfish, actually. We are not good in cooperating. There's a second strand of literature and arguments arguing that we are selfish, but it doesn't matter. Competition and self-organization do work. We don't need cooperation as a concept. Self-organization is already enough to manage affairs of societies, groups, and even the international system. And then there is a third strand of arguments, the third school in cooperation research arguing that we do cooperate. We are good at cooperation, but we are not always good at cooperation. Here the question is, what are the basic mechanisms of cooperation? Under which conditions are we able to cooperate? And I will drive you very rapidly through these three schools, and obviously I'm interested in the third one at the end of the day. You are seeing here the first school, are we good at cooperating or bad at cooperating? The first school is arguing we are bad at cooperating. And you see here some of the authors, and most of you know all these authors, of course. So it's about Thomas Hobbes, the war of everyone against everyone. So cooperation is not driving societies, conflicts and even wars are driving societies. Richard Dawkins, who is an evolutionary biologist, he wrote a book in 1976 arguing that we are driven by a selfish gene. So we are selfish at the end of the day. We are not good at cooperating. You all know Herbert Spencer, the survival of the fittest. So societies and human culture driven by competition and selfishness-driven dynamics. At the end of the day, here international relations, we saw Mersheim and many others arguing that in global affairs, it's power what international politics is about. Cooperation is something which is not strong in the international system. Then we do have the second school arguing that we are selfish, but doesn't matter. Competition and self-organization is already enough to organize societies, to organize the international system, and to solve social dilemma situations. Adam Smith, Friedrich August von Hayek, the Homo economicus concept, Robert Nozick, with his concept of the minimal state. From my perspective, these kind of scholars are underestimating the tragedy of the commons. They are underestimating that we need to manage social dilemma situations in which pure selfish-oriented actors are obviously failing always. Then we do have the third school, which is arguing that we do cooperate, but we don't cooperate always. Elinor Ostrom is one of these scholars in the field of political science and economics. Michael Tomasello, social anthropologist and linguist, is arguing that cooperation is driving human culture. The mother of our civilization is cooperation at the end of the day. Then we do have Martin Nowak, a very important and interesting scholar from the field of mathematics and evolutionary biology. He wrote a book in 2011, The Supercorporators, and he's talking about human beings, and he tries to explain to us why cooperation is driving evolution at the end of the day. So I will move a bit into this third school, why do we cooperate? And then the question, under which conditions do we cooperate? Do we know the basic mechanisms of cooperation? Is there a convergence in all these different disciplines, mathematics, evolutionary biology, linguistics, evolutionary biology, political science, about the basic factors of cooperation? Do we have a consensus on that? And you will see that we do have a consensus on that. So, different strands of arguments first. I talked about Martin Nowak. He's working at Harvard. We invited him for a summer school last August when we discussed about cooperation and the basic mechanisms of cooperation. And Martin is arguing that cooperation is the third mechanism of evolution. This is a very strong statement. Because he's arguing that beyond the two existing mechanisms of evolution, which we know, and there is a huge consensus on that, cooperation is the third driver of evolution. The first one where there is a consensus is mutation is a driver of evolution. Mutation drives diversity, redundancies, and this stabilizes evolutionary processes. The second driver is selection. And selection has something to do with efficiency and adaptability to changing environments. And then Martin shows that cooperation is the third mechanism of evolution. And he's demonstrating in mathematical models and his empirical work on evolutionary processes that at the end of the day, without cooperation, you cannot build structures. This isn't possible in societies of human beings, but also in any other context of the Earth system as such. Cooperation is the driver of building sustainable structures where elements build a system. So cooperation is the driver of building systems. And systems are more stable and sustainable over long periods of time than individuals. This is why Martin argues that cooperation is the third driver and the third mechanism of evolution. We do have other strands of literature from the field of political science and economics showing that cooperation actually is very widespread. We are not only selfish, we are not only maximizing our utilities, payoffs, maximizing optimal strategies and self-interests. Many empirical work is around, and many work has been done in the field of game theory, demonstrating that people do cooperate beyond selfishness interest. We are able to understand the interests of others and build joint interests. And many work has been done to demonstrate that. So this is a second important strand beyond evolutionary biology, where we can show that cooperation is something which is much more important than other scholars in the field of we are bad in cooperating would think about. There is then the third strand, which I already mentioned in the field of cognitive sciences, social anthropology, and linguistic, bringing together evidence for our natural predisposition to cooperate when we talk about human beings. The first observation here is that children cooperate from a very young age. So it's not a process of educating children to cooperate. Children cooperate from a very early moment on. So we do have a natural predisposition to cooperate. There is also a second important argument, this kind of disciplines, arguing that other primates, apes for example, also cooperate. So there is an evolutionary line which helps us to be cooperative as human beings. And then a third argument is being made in this kind of disciplines, showing that cooperation is not something which is only existing in certain cultures or societies. It is a cross-cultural phenomenon which is existing around the world in all societies, in all cultures. It's not only something which we have been learning in certain cultural contexts. So there is a natural predisposition for cooperation. If you move through all these different disciplines and ask the question, what are then the enabling mechanisms of cooperation? Interestingly, or for us this was very exciting, you find a huge convergence, a huge consensus about the basic mechanisms of cooperation, the elements which drive cooperation. Those are always the same. There is no big discussion about that. And at the end of the day, you find always these 7 elements, which you see here on the left-hand side in what we call then the cooperation hexagon. Again and again, you find these enabling mechanisms and drivers of cooperation. At the center, you see reciprocity. So we as human beings are less homo economici, trying to maximize our individual utilities. We are reciprocals. So we expect that others, if we cooperate with them, they also cooperate with us over long distances also. Reciprocity is something which is driving us as human beings. And then you see around reciprocity mechanisms which help to stabilize reciprocity. So it is about trust, it is about communication, it is about good or bad reputation. If you do have good reputation as someone who cooperates, easy to build up cooperation structures. If you do have a very, very bad reputation, it does not work, or it's very important to invest in reputation. It's fairness, so it's not only about finding any solution. People stop cooperating if they have the feeling that the solution is not fair. It's about enforcement mechanisms, so you need something to punish opportunistic behavior, to punish defectors which do not accept the rules of the game to cooperate. And then we do have a we identity element here. So to cooperate, you need something like a joint narrative. You need something like a joint perspective where to go. And if you bring these 7 elements together, these are the designing mechanisms for building up cooperation in any context. You need these 7 factors in small groups, but you need these 7 factors also at the global stage. From our perspective, these 7 mechanisms of, basic mechanisms of cooperation are scale-free, to say so. This is a reality in local contexts, but also at the global level. These are design criteria for building up cooperational and collaborative environments. So what does this mean for international cooperation then? And I'm coming to the end so that we do have time for discussion, obviously. And I would like to suggest 3 kinds of conclusions or suggestions which I would derive from the argument which I have been presenting to you. The first argument here is, my first conclusion is that you need a radical change in perspective from conflict and war as the father of all things and of human civilization and of global politics. Remember Mearsheimer, no? It's about power politics, it's about conflicts. This is what is driving the international system. From the perspective which I have been developing, the major argument is exactly the other way around. Cooperation is a possibility. We are good at cooperation, and cooperation is the mother of civilization. When we create structures driven by cooperation, we are able to solve problems. Of course, there are conflictive situations and war, and these are situations in which cooperation fails and explodes. But we know the mechanisms of cooperation. We know how to manage cooperation. And at the end of the day, cooperation is the mother of building structures and systems, and cooperation is what drives human civilization. So this is a radical change in perspective. This change in perspective is very important because, as Ludwig Wittgenstein, a German philosopher, argues, he says that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, and the limits of how I think, which kind of options are available and possible to solve solutions. So if our perception is that at the end of the day, the international system is driven by war and conflicts only, it's very difficult to drive processes towards cooperation. But if we understand that cooperation is the mother of civilization, that we are good at this, we do have much more options to create conditions in which cooperation at the end of the day works. So we need this radical shift in perspective. And I'm also citing here Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant once said, when he talked about the essence of enlightenment, he argued that the essence of enlightenment, so when human mankind invented democracy and human rights, was a radical change of perspective of people. So people understood that human beings do have rights. Human beings are equal individuals. Human beings are actors which can expect specific rights when it comes to interactions between individuals, citizens, and governments. So it was a shift in perspective which drove the era of enlightenment. Now, in the third big wave of global transformations in the history of human mankind, what we need to learn now and to understand now is how to build up international cooperation, global cooperation, to manage global interdependency. Again, a radical shift in perspective towards cooperation as a driver of human civilization. The second conclusion, which I would derive from the argument which I have been presenting, is that we think that bringing behavioral knowledge into international cooperation debates would help us to understand much better what we call the meso dimension of international cooperation. So we think about international negotiation rounds, we think about the climate negotiation rounds, we think about international regimes in many fields in international politics. So people are coming together here. People are interacting. And we think that understanding the basic drivers of human cooperation, remember the cooperation hexagon, we could understand much better how these negotiation rounds actually work and how to improve the mechanisms to organize international negotiation rounds based on the knowledge of human cooperation which we have to make progresses in international cooperation processes. So behavioral knowledge is important for understanding better international cooperation in very concrete contexts. We are currently doing research on these kind of questions. My third conclusion is a very fundamental one also. When we brought together these 7 elements of the cooperation hexagon, when I saw first the composition which emerged from our analysis of these different strands of disciplines on human cooperation, my first idea was, of course, if this is the basic structure of cooperation, it is easy to understand why we are currently in a G0 world, and why Charles Kupchan, with his perspective that no one cares on international affairs, is currently a reality. And obviously, when you look at these 7 factors here, you understand that beyond the power struggles which we are embedded in, because we are living in a post-modern, a post-Western world now, we do have struggles between the old Western power structures and the new emerging power constellations driven by China, by India, Brazil, and many others. So power struggles are there. But if you look at these enabling mechanisms for cooperation and then think about the G20 context, for example, all these enabling mechanisms of international cooperation need to build up in this new context. There is no trust currently. Communication structures in the G20 context are much weaker than, for example, in the European Union context, or in the context of the transatlantic partnership which have been built up during the last 6 decades. So all these elements need to be brought forward, and we need to invest in these enabling mechanisms of international cooperation to embed power structures. So the argument here would be, we need to invent and we need to think about international initiatives to improve cooperation, to strengthen these kind of international cooperation enabling mechanisms. If we would be good in that, we would be able to manage social dilemmata situations as climate negotiations, for example, and we would be able to embed global power structures within the G20 context. If we are bad in that, if you move forward only in the power dimension, we will not be able to solve social dilemmata situations, and this would imply that global cooperation, global governance would fail. So it's a 2-level game. It is about power struggles, and it is about investments in these enabling mechanisms of international cooperation, and we need much more thinking about how to do that best in able to manage social dilemmata situations in the global arenas. Thank you very much for listening.